One of Michigan's great success stories is our friends at Meijer. Locally grown, but with national impact, and I want to thank them for sponsoring this very important opening keynote address, one that is very personally important to me. Jeb Bush is a leader's leader. He has the reputation of being one of America's best and most popular governors for a reason. I've seen him in action, and he's impressive. He, as the governor of Florida, was a transformative figure. He led the way for education reform in the United States. He raised academic standards, but more importantly, he raised academic achievement results, and he narrowed the achievement gap. As governor, he streamlined government. He lowered taxes. He reformed economic development approaches, all of which leading to national leading job growth during his time as governor of Florida. Governor Bush maintains his passion for education. He chairs two important foundations focused on it: the Excellence in Education Foundation and the Foundation for Florida's Future. His current book, Immigration Wars, challenges conventional thinking and many in his own party on the current debate regarding immigration reform. And he frames the debate in the terms of economic prosperity for our nation and the creativity and the vitality of our society. His voice in education, in immigration, and a whole host of other issues is perhaps one of the most important in the nation today, for he has the credibility of the results he's achieved, and he has a national platform. Everyone here knows that Governor Jeb Bush is the brother of President George W. Bush and the son of President George Herbert Walker Bush, a man that he, and frankly I, call our hero. But the one Bush in this political spotlight right now that he's probably most interested in is his son, who is currently running for statewide office in Texas, and he is an impressive man. Jeb Bush not only comes from an amazing family, he is wicked smart, he is results-oriented, he's a funny guy, and for those of you who had the privilege of running into him in the lobby because he's been there all day today, incredibly down-to-earth, but with incredibly strong convictions. And we are incredibly honored to have him here today. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the 43rd governor of the state of Florida, the Honorable Jeb Bush.
Thank you all. Thanks. Thanks a lot. Please sit down. Thank you, Sandy, for that kind introduction. That storyboard over there makes me a little nervous on the left-hand side. If you're going to do a caricature of me, could you make me look a lot skinnier than I am, please? It is great to be with you all. I've always wanted to come to this beautiful island. I felt like John Candy last night. Some of you may have had the same experience. Other than the train, I took every form of transportation to come here. It was a blast. And then I got to go to what perhaps is, Governor, the finest, maybe the only second home a governor has in the history of the United States. It was a blast doing that as well. And the sweet aroma of the early morning to make it to the hotel was a special part of my gathering here as well. But I've come to you, Governor Snyder, thank you for your remarks. This guy is really refreshing. I don't know, I guess I watch too much cable television. where people kind of do this, you know, they kind of chirp at each other. Here's a guy who's common sense, who wants to get stuff done, who's civil, who doesn't blame anybody. Wow, kind of refreshing. You know, I often hear Detroit described as a tale of two cities. The first city is on the verge of collapse. That's the one that makes the headlines nationally. It has weakened structural changes. It was weakened by the structural changes of the industrial economy and then brought to its knees by years of government mismanagement and reckless spending. The second is filled with hope and vibrancy. It is attracting entrepreneurs from around the world, people who are investing in their own dreams and creating jobs and rebuilding the urban core. In fact, we all need to learn a little bit from the lessons of Detroit. For years, many of its political leaders ignored the warnings of looming fiscal calamity. They relied on budget gimmicks and borrowing to limp from one fiscal crisis to the next, one election to the next, creating a house of cards so aptly described by Kevin Orr. Detroit is insolvent, facing massive short-term deficits and, unfortunately, $15 billion of long-term unfunded liabilities. The dodge is over because inevitably these things aren't sustainable, and the bill is due, and the residents and city employees are suffering consequences that you don't need to have me stand here and rehash. When you read Mr. Orr's report, which I did, you wonder, how could any business move to Detroit? But the genius of America is in that in the free market, people seek new opportunities. They always do. Entrepreneurs turn empty buildings into new manufacturing centers. They find idled workers whose skills they can put to use. They plant flowers in the desert. The flowers grow into gardens and attract more entrepreneurs. It's an organic healing process that has been part of our life in this country since its inception. To quote a story in the New York Times, private industry is blooming here, even as the city's finances have descended into wreckage. City Hall can't bring Detroit back alone. City Hall can't create new industries and new jobs. The best thing that City Hall can do is mitigate the damage done and create the field of dreams, if you will, an attractive business climate for those who can bring Detroit back. And now for the reason, perhaps, that we all need to learn from this. Can you imagine the report Kevin Orr would write on Washington, D.C.? If he thinks $15 billion of unfunded liabilities is bad, what would he think of $80 billion? Which, in effect, if you take the net present value of our unfunded entitlement obligations combined with our growing debt, is a conservative estimation of what we have. Washington is like Detroit, but with a printing press. But all that freshly minted money eventually must be paid for, and that will require robust economic growth and some serious structural reforms in taxes, regulation, and most importantly, entitlements. Both growth and reform will require consensus, and I know I'm going to use the C word here. Please don't be offended when I use this word, because in Washington, D.C., this increasingly is a bad word to use, compromise, across the partisan divide to build consensus for our country to deal with the similar challenges that you all are facing here in Detroit. The debate in Washington right now seems to be about how you grow the economy by either austerity in Washington or more spending in Washington. Most of us outside the Beltway know better. We know America's greatness is really based on its ability to unleash the power of individuals to create prosperity and opportunity, and in the pursuit of their own dreams, they create more opportunities for others, and that cascading effect is what creates the benefits of growth and the chance for a better life. From the relentless pursuit of a better way to taking risks and accepting failure and celebrating success, America has emerged as the richest and most productive nation in history. As a country, we're retreating from this proven formula. We're getting a little complacent, I'm afraid, and we're ceding greater power to governments, particularly in Washington, under the false assumption that centralized control makes us more secure. The more government tries to control outcomes for people, the more it limits their potential. As Ronald Reagan said, government exists to protect us from each other. Where government has gone beyond its limits is in deciding to protect us from ourselves. Today, government is picking, increasingly so, the winners and losers in society. The banks are too big to fail, while small businesses and entrepreneurs are too regulated, too mandated, and too taxed to thrive. This is certainly not the America that turned the world on its head for over a century. In my post-gubernatorial life, I've got to travel all around the world. If you go to Beijing, or Hong Kong, or Singapore, or Tel Aviv, or Sao Paulo, Bogota, Bangalore, Santiago de Chile, Mexico City, in all of these countries, in different ways, they get it. They prioritize economic growth over all other goals. They adopt dynamic policies that lead to greater competition, greater opportunities for those willing to work hard, greater family formation, greater immigration and labor market growth, and greater investments in the long-term things like energy and infrastructure. Their strategy is to look decades ahead, not worry about the here and now. They want to beat us by becoming like we were, while we're trying to become more like Europe is. What must America do to regain its footing? At the most basic level, we must tap into our human capital. There's an unspoken right in our country, but one just as sacred as those found in our sacred Bill of Rights. And that is the right to rise. The right for all Americans to reach their full potential, to move up social and economic ladders according to their own abilities. This means letting them to take risks and compete for business, letting them enjoy the fruits of good decisions and suffer the consequences of bad decisions, letting them take a gamble on Detroit when others are too timid, and letting them reap the rewards for taking on that risk. Increasingly, for many of our children, this right to rise depends on access to a quality education. We can't give every child an equal start in life, although it would be, if a fairy godmother landed on my shoulder, I might ask that as my dream for all wholesome families to be able to have all children start at life at the same place, but that's not reality. But we should give them an equal shot through a high-quality education. We worry about whether our kids have self-esteem. We worry way too much about whether our kids have self-esteem. Other countries worry about whether their kids have a deep understanding of algebra and physics. They're preparing their children for a very competitive 21st century economy where the most skilled and educated workforces will dominate. We're not rising to the challenge. Only 4 kids in 10 go through the most expensive education process in the world, where we spend more per student than all but a handful of countries. 4 in 10 complete this journey by the end of 12th grade, college and/or career ready. It is shameful. The greatest country on the face of the earth complacently has allowed this to happen. Democrats, Republicans, liberals, that is totally irrelevant here. We've decided that that's no longer an important value for our country. Imagine what the world looks like if we continue down this path, where the demands placed on government by the 6 out of 10, 3 of which don't graduate from high school at all, and the other 3 or 4 end up having to take remedial courses, relearning high school math and high school English before they begin to take courses at a community college or a university, and certainly have to be retrained if they want to pursue a career from high school. This is a shameful set of facts that we've allowed to happen, and the result is that we're not producing enough scientists or welders, doctors or plumbers, mechanics, software engineers, and nurses. Despite high unemployment and the greatest downturn since the Great Depression, there have been, during this entire time, 3 million skilled jobs going unfilled. Think of the lost productivity that can be measured in billions of dollars, where we sit back and we recognize that we're not building capacity for the next generation, and in doing so, we're imperiling our own future. This is, in fact, in large part due to a public education system that dumbs down standards for kids to make adults look better. It's an example of government making itself the priority. We can't just outsource education to bureaucracies and to public employee unions and then hope for the best. We can't accept failure for a wide swath of our kids under the guise of compassion. His mom is poor. He can't learn. Don't make him pass that test. It's not fair. How many times do we hear this? In direct ways and in subtle ways, and in doing so, we do not confront one of the great social challenges of our time. And then we make amends with a lifetime of programs designed to help people that can't live an independent life of meaning and purpose themselves, in lieu of building capacity for individual success. 90% of people on welfare and 75% of Americans on food stamps are high school dropouts. Education done right is the only government program that I'm aware of capable of curing poverty. And so we must press for systemic and transformational changes in our schools. Early childhood literacy must become a national priority, as Governor Snyder has requested. In Florida, we created a gateway at the end of 3rd grade. If you're functionally illiterate in 3rd grade, you don't go to 4th grade. Now, the standard in the United States is self-esteem would dictate that you send a child, even though they can't read, to 4th grade, knowing that in 4th grade, children begin to acquire knowledge. That's what they do. They begin to learn things in 4th grade. Up till 3rd grade, they're learning how to read. But we've been so complacent, we've not created this gateway. And in doing so, we've not challenged the basic fact that we need to focus on early literacy at the earliest levels to assure that all 3rd graders gain the power of knowledge, the ability to read, so that those learning gaps don't start, and then we excuse it away by saying it's not fair. Every child must be able to read before entering 4th grade, because after that, catching up and dealing with the huge achievement gaps that exist are increasingly difficult. Yet in this country, half of our African American and Hispanic 4th graders are functionally illiterate. America as we know it is not sustainable if we do not address this one issue. There must be consequences for poor performance on tests that measure critical thinking skills. If there are not, fewer kids will master those skills. What gets measured gets done. If you have low expectations and you don't have accountability around each child, the net result is we get what we've gotten. We must raise expectations for all children in the form of more rigorous academic standards at all grade levels, in all key subjects. We must expand opportunities for children with digital technology, giving kids in the poorest parts of Detroit access to the best curriculum in the world. We must attract the best and brightest into teaching and pay them according to the job that they do. Now, I know that sounds like another radical idea, paying someone more when they have learning gains for their children that they're in front of and they do a magnificent job. That somehow that is a radical idea in America today? That is at the core of who we are. And yet that has become huge battlegrounds, huge fights across the state capitals. We must give parents a choice of where they send their children to school. If a Martian came down to America today and was asked to study, maybe a McKinsey Martian, make him a real professional. He came down and he was asked to study the governance model of K-12 education. He would have to report back to the higher-ups back in Mars that this is surprising. This incredibly dynamic country, while it is kind of paused in its growth and its innovation, has a governance model of 13,174 government-run monopolies, heavily unionized, as the governance model for the most important service that a society can deliver, which is assuring that children gain the power of knowledge. My guess is the Martian would make a series of recommendations, perhaps, to move our system to a child-centered system, away from adults, and make sure that every parent had a choice, not just the one that the monopoly dictated that they go to, many of which are failing, but to give them choices to improve all schools. The states that have done this have seen significant gains in student achievement. It is an American way to provide choices. When you go to Meijer supermarket, which I haven't had the luxury to do, but who knows, might be able to make it when I leave here today, and you go to the milk location, which I get to do at Publix in Coral Gables. There are 17 different versions of milk today. You can get whole milk. You can get 2% milk. You can get skim milk. You can get chocolate milk. You can get strawberry milk. You can get soy milk. You can get almond milk. You can get milk that's not milk, literally. That makes us a better, by having these choices, we can live a better life. Why wouldn't we want to have parents have choices for their children's education? In Florida, where we began on this journey, all schools get better when you empower people, particularly those living in poverty that don't have choices. When you give them power to choose, they're more engaged in their students' learning, their child's learning, and all schools get better. Michigan has been a leader here as an early pioneer in the charter school movement. A recent Stanford University study noted that Michigan charters outperform traditional public schools in the state, justifying, in my mind, the 2011 decision to allow charters to expand. This includes online charter schools, which are the bridge to a modern, digitized 21st century education system. And I'd like to thank the governor's work on this and State Education Chair Senator Pavlo and House Education Chair Lisa Lyons for their hard work and leadership on comprehensive education reform issues. When they come to the conference, give them a hug for me, because it's a job well done. It's not popular to make these tough decisions, and they've done the right thing. Some have claimed that some of Michigan's reforms, such as the EAA and lifting the charter school caps and performance pay for teachers, are unproven experiments. Well, let me tell you about an experiment that has completely failed. Schools that consistently fail students year after year after year. The result is African-American fourth graders in this state are more than a grade behind their national peers when it comes to reading proficiency. Perhaps the Florida story offers a version of a different way. In Florida, we grade schools A, B, C, D, and F, 100% based on student learning, half on gains, half on proficiency. We eliminated social promotion in third grade to the consternation of the system, but it cut in half the number of kids that were functionally illiterate. We created early childhood literacy, where we taught teachers how to teach reading. And every teacher in elementary school learned the basic skills to make science and math and social studies all opportunities to improve reading. We embraced school choice across the board. And in this comprehensive way, we went from literally the bottom of the pack, based on the nation's report card, to above the national average in 10 years. African-American kids, ESE kids, limited English proficient kids, Hispanic kids, low-income kids, every one of those disaggregated groups based on the NAEP fourth grade reading and eighth grade reading are in the top 5 in the country. Florida went literally from the bottom of the pack, allowing people in Florida to whisper, thank God for, I won't name the names of the 2 states that were behind us, to being a national leader. We can move the needle if we shake the complacency and eliminate the political correctness that makes it, I guess, acceptable and refined company to say that some kids can learn and some kids can't. I hope that this chamber challenges that notion each and every day. Lastly, I want to commend Michigan for its leadership, and particularly the governor, in 2 critical areas, math and English language arts, in raising standards. There's a big debate now nationally about this, but what we ought to focus on are the standards that we have today benchmarked to the best in the world. One of your pillars is to be world-class, to be competitive in a global economy. And that starts by benchmarking every important thing that we do to the best in the world. If we're going to be the best country and not just talk about it, we need to actually do the work to make it happen. Higher standards is a key element of that. And these standards, the Common Core state standards, are clear and straightforward. They will allow for more innovation in the classroom, less regulation. They'll equip students to compete with their peers across the globe. Do not pull back. Please do not pull back from high, lofty standards. The greatest mistake we make in public education is underestimating the capacity of our children to learn. And when we do that, particularly with our at-risk kids, we take from them the American dream of social mobility. We take from them the right to rise. In addition to maximizing our own homegrown talent, it is also critical that we maintain an incredible American experiment, which is allowing people from other countries to come to this great land to pursue their dreams in a unique American way that adds vitality to our neighborhoods, to our communities, and to our country. Immigrants striving to rise has always been an essential ingredient to this hopeful, optimistic land. During the Great Depression, for example, a Dutch immigrant barber named Hendrik Meyer and his 14-year-old son, I guess there weren't child labor laws, Governor, in the Depression during Michigan, Frederick, started a grocery store to help their customers. And from that evolved the modern supercenter. Meyer celebrated its 200th store opening in Swartz Creek, Michigan last month. And in the spirit of Hendrik and Frederick, Meyer donates 6% of its profits to the communities where it does business. This tradition continues today. Just as it was during the Great Depression, today immigrants are twice as likely to start businesses than American-born citizens, according to the Kauffman Foundation report. Immigrants, in essence, are the adrenaline to our economic system. And at no time have they been more critical for our nation. America's birth rate has dropped to below break even, the lowest rate in American history. Now, I don't know about you, I am, as a grandfather, trying to single-handedly change this from the Bush family perspective without great success. I've got 2, I'd love to have 20, but that's not going to happen. Millions of baby boomers at the same time are retiring. All of us 10 years from now, God willing, are going to be 10 years older. That's the plan, right? You're with me. And our social contract depends on a demographic pyramid that only immigration can rebuild. We need comprehensive immigration reform for a lot of reasons, but I would say the premier, most important reason is for sustained economic growth. And we need this reform that respects our immigrant heritage as well as the rule of law. It also must recognize our own self-interest, which means that family-based immigration should be narrowed to reuniting spouses and minor children, not the current broader definition, the only country in the world, by the way, that has this broader definition that creates chain migration for years to come. In fact, you don't have to look too far, cross the waters over to Canada, and you would find an immigration system that's dramatically different. In Canada, there are more economic immigrants on an annual basis, in spite of the fact they have 1/10 of our population. They have more economic immigrants than the United States does today. 75% of our immigrants come from this broad definition of family reunification. 13% come for economic purposes. And that dynamic is flipped on its head in Canada. No wonder Canada's immigration model is the one that is being applied all across the country. We need border control to maintain the rule of law for sure, but we also need to recognize that some 40% of all the illegal immigrants in our country came with a legal visa that expired and no one called on them to ask them to leave. It seems like a great country ought to be able to figure out where to find these folks and politely ask them to go back to their country of origin and apply to pursue their dreams, just as many others have done. We need a robust guest worker program based on economic need to help sustain industries like tourism and agriculture. Graduates of STEM fields should stay if they have a job and start a business. H-1B visas should be expanded dramatically. In fact, I would open it up as far as the eye could see, and a path to residency made easier so that these great catalytic converters of sustained economic growth pursue their dreams in this country rather than be trained here and then be shipped back to their country of origin to be our economic competitors. For the millions that are here illegally, there needs to be a path to legal status achieved by paying a fine, learning English, not violating laws over an extended period of time. It is not the American way to keep people in the shadows. In fact, the lost productivity, if you look at it through the economic lens, the lost productivity of not embracing people's chance to be able to be successful in a balanced way is a missed opportunity of economic income that would change the debate in Washington, by the way. If we were growing our economy at, say, 2% more than we're growing it today, say 4% instead of 2%, and we decided that we'd put aside our differences and create a strategy to make that happen, that 2% extra economic growth would create a Germany in the 10th year. The power of compounding is a mighty powerful thing. A Germany of 4.5 or 4.7 additional economic activities, trillion dollars of economic activity, would create $1 trillion of revenue for government at all levels. $1 trillion recurring, not the way they do it, Congressman, where you multiply it times 10 to make it look huge. This is $1 trillion a year of recurring revenue. My guess is there'd be a different debate about who's paying what and how much should be paid if we were growing at that clip. And that's what we could do if we created a strategy around immigration reform. And finally, I would suggest to you that we need to make civics education a priority. It's really not an immigration issue. This is a national issue. It is appalling. It is truly appalling how little we know about our past and how important it is for us to maintain who we are as a nation. What distinguishes our country from many others is we don't have race as our national identifier. We don't have ethnicity that drives the discussion about who's on top and who isn't. Our values, our citizenship is based on a set of shared values. And those have eroded over time because we've let them erode for no other reason. And it seems to me we need to, if we're going to restore our greatness as a country, civics education and rebinding ourselves together, both native-born Americans and those that want to be Americans, is a huge element of this. I'm tired of the Jay Leno jokes. I know they're really funny when people say these outrageously stupid things about our country's history. I would love to have Jay Leno stories on the street where people actually answered the question correctly and understood why it was important. Call me old-fashioned, but I think immigration, to be successful, has to embrace this idea as well. Immigrants come to learn English, to understand our history, to become as American as we are, and in doing so, to reinvigorate all of us, to remind ourselves of our nation's past so that we can be successful in the future. The issues I've talked about, are actually solvable. The amazing thing is these are not intractable issues. We can reform our education system. There's so many things that we've done over the last generation of time that have been incredibly successful. And we can change our immigration laws. In fact, it may actually happen this year, God willing. But all of this will require leadership. For a successful leader, everything comes second to good public policy. Politics, polls, personal pride, financial gain, even friends. Leaders cut through all of that and focus on sound policy. They find to find good examples of that kind of leadership, you don't have to go too far. The Midwest has seen a resurgence, in my mind, because of great public sector leaders. Governor Scott Walker didn't take on collective bargaining rights for public employees because he enjoyed the political circus and literally becoming the target of a whole lot of people that didn't appreciate what he did. He did it because it was the right thing to do to create a sustainable Wisconsin. Governor Kasich knew that when he cut $8 billion out of a budget, that there would be all sorts of people against that he wouldn't win popularity contests, but he did it because he knew that that was the building block of creating the beginning of a sustained economic growth for Ohio. In January, Governor Mitch Daniels left as perhaps the most popular governor on the stage today to become the president of Purdue University, but he was also one of the most successful. His popularity came after his success in terms of crafting new policy. He steered Indiana through the Great Recession by cutting budgets that were essential to do so, by attracting industries and securing the highest bond rating that any state can be allowed. And your governor has done the same thing. He wasn't reading polls when he signed into law the right to work legislation. He was trying to keep Michigan competitive. Michigan not only has to keep up with Indiana, they also have to keep up with every state in the South that is trying to replace Michigan as the source of future production in the automobile industry and all of the affiliated service industries that go around it. And not only do you have to worry about the Southeast, you also have to worry about Canada that has made structural reforms the hallmark of their country, and Mexico, which is going through significant structural changes to allow it to be globally competitive, and certainly Asia, where there is a constant renewal to be able to be competitive. We're living in a global economy, and the leaders that have the courage to change things to allow states to be competitive are the ones that may not be the most popular. Sometimes they are, sometimes they're not. But they're the ones that should be held up high as examples for the next generation of leaders because they have the guts to do what they think is right. And I commend you, Rick, for the job that you've done here in Michigan, doing the hard work of positioning this great state to be able to take care, to be forward-looking, to be able to fulfill its destiny. You've led on balanced budgets, on regulatory reform, on overhaul of the tax code. You've created greater stability for this community and this state to have a better business climate, and the payoff will come over the long haul, which is really what this should be about. He was a leader in opposing Proposal 2, which would have had really, truly, with all due respect, disastrous long-term consequences for economic growth and for government budgets in this state. And like Florida, Michigan took a hard hit during the Great Recession, and unemployment won't drop back down to 5% overnight. But these reforms that Governor Snyder and the legislature and that many of you have supported will put a foundation on below Michigan for it to begin to pursue the next iteration of dreams for this great state that will occur over the next decades of time. That is leadership. Looking over the horizon, having a strategy in a principle-centered way to carry out that strategy in a meaningful way where everyone benefits. I never thought I would say this, but that's the strategy of one tough nerd. And it's the same strategy that will be, and my prediction is the same strategy applied in Detroit will have the exact same result. That this incredible metropolitan area that many of you live in and that this chamber represents is full of potential. Not just to look back in the past to see what happened there, but take the suggestions of the past and apply them in a 21st century way. My guess is that 10 years from now, when you look back, you said, yeah, we had a bump in the road. We had real challenges, but it was a wake-up call. We reorganized ourselves. We made sure that every person in this region had a chance to be successful because we built capacity the old-fashioned way. We assured that they had the power of knowledge to be able to pursue their dreams. We created an infrastructure around the most needy without creating dependency. We created a chance to lift them up. And then we allowed the best business climate in the world to create prosperity for everybody. That's the mission that you all are involved in, and I bet you'll do it. God bless you all, and thanks a lot.
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome business columnist and associate business editor for the Detroit News, Daniel Howes.
Well, I'm glad to see that somebody else recognizes the lessons of Detroit for America, because I think that's the mistakes that were made were certainly something that we're learning the hard way.
Well, we have structural problems in our country that left unaddressed. The power of compounding on economic growth, I did that actually on a tarmac in O'Hare.
Right.
Took 16 trillion times 1.02, 10 times. It actually are 18 trillion now. It creates, almost $5 trillion of incremental economic growth. So the power of compounding can be your friend, but allowing structural problems to languish can be a huge enemy as well. And that's kind of where we are as a nation. We got to start solving these problems.
You've laid out a lot of challenges, I think, to the audience and some really knotty ones. You talked about immigration and the importance of immigration. What strikes me about this, and I think we talked about it earlier today, was why immigration? Why is there alignment between the Republicans and Democrats in Washington, and is it simply because the Republicans got waxed in the last presidential election?
Well, I think there's some motivation. Having an L in your, it's always better to have a W in your column rather than an L, and losing 2 presidential elections, increasingly seeing, to me, the canary in the coal mine politically would be the Asian American community. Mm-hmm. It's a very diverse group: Indians, Pakistanis, Filipinos, Koreans, Chinese, Japanese. It's a very diverse group, but it voted 75% for President Obama, 23% for Mitt Romney. Now, if you look at this group in the aggregate, this is a group that has higher than the average median income in the country, higher intact family, significantly higher college graduation rates, and significantly higher entrepreneurial business startup rates. If that Martian that I mentioned came down, he would have to conclude, without knowing the actual results, that would be a Republican core constituency. But in fact, it's not. And the reason it's not is that if you hear the voices that aren't part of the mainstream of the conservative cause, you would think that they're not wanted. It's really kind of, it's mind-boggling to me. I mean, I always tried to win when I ran, you know. I'm not sure what I'm missing here. And so sending a signal that we want your vote, but you really can't join our club. Right. I mean, that's kind of what people hear if they're watching this with their peripheral vision, is not the right way to win. So I think there was a recognition of that. And so for pure political reasons, there's an interest. And then I would say from the Republican side, there's a recognition also that we need to start growing our economy, and Republicans need to be involved in the conversation about what economic growth looks like. And I think you can make a very powerful case that a economically driven immigration policy is better than a broken one in terms of economic growth. I mean, I don't think that's too hard to argue, and Republicans have embraced that. And on the other side, you have another political reality, which is you can't keep going to the well without solving the problem. So the president, you know, was quite successful in 2008 and 2012 with many of these groups that have a nexus to immigration, but you can't keep saying you're going to fix it and not do it. So there was, I think, a convergence in that regard, convergence that's been exploited in a positive way, both in the Senate, which we see about, and probably in the House as well.
Would you go so far as to say that your party will not win the presidency until they get a cohesive policy on immigration that is more inclusive than it's thus far been?
You know, the circumstances can always change. I frankly think that the motivation ought to be that calculation on American Airlines plane on the tarmac in O'Hare. This is a means by which everybody can benefit, and that ought to be the focus, is how do you create sustained economic growth? It ought to be a patriotic energy policy based on our own resources and American innovation. And you all, underneath you, you have the potential to take full advantage of that. The shale revolution in this country is real. It's exciting. It's game-changing for rebirth of industries and manufacturing, lessening our balance of payments deficits, lessening our need for a massive footprint around the world to change our foreign policy and national security policy to be more relevant in the 21st century. There are a lot of things that we could do. Immigration would be one of them, to create a story, a narrative, as they say in Washington, that's about a more hopeful message than just being against what the president's for. We should be for what we're for and persuade people that's the right way to go.
If I understand what you're saying about immigration, there was a political crisis that has driven both parties, particularly the Republicans, to the discussion. There isn't the same kind of national crisis on education, or at least recognized. Listening to you, there
That's
is,
right.
It's being dealt with at the state level. But when I listen to what you talk about education, two things come to mind. Number one, that this may be one of the civil rights issues of our time in terms of what's happening to a lot of young people around the country. And two is that adults are not telling kids the truth. They are essentially lowering standards, telling them they don't need to learn foreign languages and do a lot of other things that make them competitive in the real world.
Yeah, no, it's a tragedy that is kind of drip, drip, drip. It's not the kind of crisis that, you know, dominates cable news. You know, so we don't see it each and every day. It doesn't have the drama of people, you know, surrounding the state capitol and demanding some change. And, you know, Ed Schmidt, or whatever his name is, on MSNBC isn't camped out somewhere. You're trying to create the sharp differences. And on, you know, Fox, this is not something that has reached the level of national crisis, but in fact, it's perhaps our greatest crisis. So, and I would put one footnote on what you said, which is the general feeling about education is, well, this is a problem of the urban core. This is a problem of kids in poverty. This is a problem across the board. If you measure, which has been done by lots of groups, but Rick Hanashek has done the best work on this, measuring international benchmark tests like the PISA test. When you compare middle-income kids in the United States to middle-income kids in the countries that are getting it right on education, we don't do that well. And our highest achieving kids are competitive, but they're not the best in the world either. But we think that all of our kids are above average. It's the kids that we don't know that aren't. and no one has the righteousness to say it's a systemic problem yet. And I hope that it does. And then I'd say back to politics here, because you brought up an interesting point that I don't talk about that much, I'm not asked about, which is the alignment of political interests and the impact on maybe breakthrough policy happening, which it makes it easier, right? In education, you have a weird dynamic taking place where there's a center-left coalition against reform. I mean, excuse me, a right-left coalition against reform and a right-left coalition for reform. And it's confusing because core constituencies are not really tied to the political coalitions around the issues. So you have Randy Weingarten and Glenn Beck talking about Common Core state standards in a similar kind of way. And you have Michelle Rhee, who's a left of center political person now, or she's self-described Democrat, and I'm a Republican that have a very shared view on education reform. That makes it a little bit harder also, to create winning strategies, and it's state by state rather than the federal government. So it's a little harder to bring about the policy changes.
Well, here in Michigan, in the middle of the last decade, there was the great embarrassment that we did not have a common curriculum for high school graduation. It was one of the few times where you saw a Democratic governor and a Republican Senate get together, put through some standards. Now, in the last few years, there's been this continual effort to try and erode those standards, to get rid of foreign languages, to do other.
You guys have an Algebra 2 requirement, don't you? That's where you need to be, and I'm sure there's pushback on that because it just always is.
But what is the message as a Republican leader to state legislatures, would you say, about what they don't get? Because I think we talked about this earlier. You travel around the world, you speak another language, you've studied this professionally. What is it that people in your party don't get about the real challenges facing the education?
You know what? I mean, I would say the reality is around the country, the biggest reforms, not just on standards, but across the board, are really being implemented by Republicans. You look at some of the reforms and you have party line votes across the board,
right,
and it's typically Democrats that are opposed to the reforms. The standards debate is a little different because there's fear of federal government overreach, and it's been exploited perhaps in a way that, it's legitimate. If you think that student ID numbers are going to be gobbled up by the federal government and somehow used, or if you think that how we teach civics or how we teach social studies will be dictated by national entities, corporate entities, along with the Department of Education, that can get people all riled up. But that's not what Common Core state standards have done. The majority of these states, 45 of them that have embraced this, did so with Republican governors and Republican either mixed legislatures or Republican-controlled legislatures. But now the pushback has begun because people are fearful of when they hear all these things. And it's incumbent upon leaders, and hopefully our foundation will play a role in this, is to provide enough information to let people chill a little bit, get a sense of what this means, explain to them why higher standards, fewer standards is another part of this. I mean, you look at a textbook in your kids' schools, and a math textbook will look this big. These poor little kids are going to have broken necks, and backs will be our next great challenge because their backpacks are full of these things. And because we've created standards in a politically, a committee format where everybody's got to have their standard in there to show that they're relevant, and we have way too many standards. And in effect, too many standards are no standards. And that's kind of what we have in most places. And so I think we need to do a better job explaining what we have is not good, what we could have is a lot better.
You described in your remarks about how the Midwestern Republican governors are doing a lot of solutions-based approaches, and they're succeeding to greater and lesser degrees. Yet at the national level, the party in a lot of ways seems to be more of a Southern party, and there's this kind of a balkanization between two approaches. How does a leader, to use the phrase you were talking about, bridge that balkanization and pull that party more together than it has been in recent years?
Well, that's work in progress, isn't it? I mean, I would say, I'm not sure we're, at the federal level, we're increasingly a party that is disproportionately found in the South and West. New England's kind of gone. The Midwest has diminished a bit. Although the 2010 election thanks to the reaction to Obamacare's passage, I think more than anything else, created a resurgence in the Midwest. And governors now leading, I think, will allow the party to be competitive here. But on a national basis, we got to be for things again. It's important to oppose respectfully things you disagree with, but at the same time, I think in the world we live in, we also, it's incumbent upon people that have a view to express about, okay, you're against Obamacare. What are you for? You know, are you for a different approach? I mean, the last time I checked, our healthcare system wasn't that hot prior to the passage of the Affordable Care Act. Insurance was not accessible, it wasn't working, and there are reasons why that's the case. And there is a conservative alternative that focuses on insurance as it should be, which is high deductible catastrophic coverage on the insurance side and focus on prevention and quality on the delivery side. And there's a way to craft a conservative position, maybe where you create equal tax treatment between individuals and corporations. Maybe there's portability allowed, so you create a more competitive marketplace. There's a lot of good ideas out there that Republicans have kind of, if there are people advancing them, they're not getting the attention.
Was this the renewal you're talking about? I mean,
yeah.
You've talked about the need for renewal in both parties. What are the markers of a renewal in your party?
Well, the markers would be having the most pressing problem I think we face is, apart from education, would be this massively convoluted tax code and entitlements. And there is a solution there with both of them on the table where everybody gets what they want and gives a little of what they don't want to give to be able to craft something that would be more successful in the 21st century. It could be like the Simpson-Bowles idea or a version of that. I think Republicans need to engage in that regard because if we don't solve these problems, they overwhelm us. They're just, the power of compounding are significant. It's not a happy thing, you know, to deal with problems, but look at the countries that people perceive to be successful. Canada, Germany a little bit later, but Canada and Sweden in the 1990s made major structural reforms. They had huge problems, and they made structural reforms, and they have become significantly more competitive and have advanced in relation to the rest of the developed world.
And they're more
Germany's
market-based.
and they're market-based. I mean, Sweden, we always talk about how socialist Sweden is.
It's not what it used to be.
Oh my God. Sweden, by the way, has a totally voucherized, privatized education system. You have companies that run public schools, and their outcomes are pretty magnificent. There's a lot more innovation, and they have a huge immigrant population, and they don't excuse it away. Everybody learns 3 languages, at least the school I went to in Stockholm. I met a kid from Baghdad. He looked like Julius Erving. He had an afro back, if you remember Julius Erving of the 70s, not the 2013 variety. He had this huge afro. He's a 14-year-old kid, 6'4", from Somalia, not Baghdad. And he was in 8th grade. He'd been in the country for a year. He spoke very good English. He knew Swedish. And he asked me, for high school I have to take a 3rd language. Which one do you think I should take? Should it be Mandarin or Spanish or French? And I gave my view, which was, brother, you ought to go to Spanish. There's you may migrate towards our part of the world, and I think we'd like to have you hang out in this hemisphere. And he said, no, I think I'm going Mandarin. I mean, this is an 8th grade kid 2 years out of Somalia. They had high expectations for every kid, at least last time I checked in Stockholm. And they don't have this whole, oh, we can't do this because it's not we can't challenge the governance model. Come on. Sweden did it, and they keep doing it. And Sweden is a country that we used to think was in its demise because of its socialist economic policies. They have discarded those things. And for the life of me, the most dynamic country in the world has been the United States. It seems to me we could say, at least, for a brief moment, maybe what we did in 1990 might not work in 2013. Maybe what we did in 1970 may not be as relevant in 2020. Maybe it's okay to actually think about a different way of doing things.
Sounds like a leadership problem. So what's the missing component as you kind of survey political leadership today and compare what's going on in some states and what's going on in Washington and not going on? What's the missing component?
I'd say there's two things. One is public leadership. I think there's a perception that it's too much of a risk, at least in Washington, to take the big chance. The upside isn't as big as the downside. You know, my answer to that is, how do you know unless you try? Don't think there's been a lot of trying recently, so maybe I'm wrong, but I think you have to challenge that assumption by engagement, and that's what happens at the state level regularly. Your governor and many others, Democrats and Republicans, by the way, are doing just that. So this is not a contagion that is spread throughout the political system. This seems to be confined, thankfully, inside the Beltway. And the other thing is that we ignore cultural changes. You talk, the governor and Sandy talked about one of your pillars being, how do you change culture? There's a broader question of culture in our country today that is also important. That we have a culture today that is driven by the here and now, both in terms of business and just life and what people's aspirations are, what they define a life of purpose to be. It's a very different country than it was 20 years ago. And culture is defined by the interaction of all of us, this crazy place of 20 million people. All of our interactions create who we are, and that's culture. And it's not as robust a culture as it once was. This is way above my pay grade, but I do think that it makes it harder for public leaders, at least, that have all of these multi-dimensional elements of what they do. It makes it harder for them to break through because the milieu in which they're operating is very different than it was. And I'll just leave you what I consider to be a really depressing factoid, which is, they came out with the census in 2010. It's the first time I saw it, at least. And that is that we have a 42% out of wedlock birth rate in this country today. And so immediately, again, in a lot of audiences, that's babies in poverty. No, it isn't, not anymore. It's not that way anymore because our culture has changed. And all I know, look, I'm not a social scientist, but I know that two adults that love their children with all their heart and soul are going to be better than one adult that loves their child or children with all their heart and soul. Just more hands, boots on the ground, if you will, more involvement, more engagement. And to suggest that we can fill that void just with another government program, I don't think that's working out too well. So culture also matters, and that changes in a different way. I've been reading about this because I'm troubled by it, as you might tell in my concern, my nature of my brow here. I'm worried about this, and I think you can see in American history where there's been real transformational changes in our culture that have put us back on track. The 1830s, the Reformation movement that created the women's suffrage movement and brought some stability to this, to the frontier towns that were actually east of where we are, that created, a rebirth of church attendance and more stability, a more moral focus on what was important in life. And the abolition movement actually came from this Reformation that started in the 1830s in response to too much moving too fast, creating too much instability. The 60s changed who we are, maybe not for the better. But these cultural changes happen, and they normally happen without, political interference. It has nothing to do with politics.
They just happen. We're pretty much out of time, but there will be another presidential election, another campaign. And where
are you going with this?
Listen, I can tell you if I didn't ask this question, I'd be accosted by 15 people out here. What's your thinking on running for the nomination?
My thinking is to not think about it for a year, because I'm 60. I know I look like I don't look a day over 59, I know, but life teaches you that you need to make decisions in the right time, not too early, not too late.
Right.
And for me, making that decision, because it's a hard decision, as it relates to family and relates to whether or not I got the right stuff to be able to run and be successful at it. And so I'm going to take my time doing that. And so I'll check in, maybe a year from now, 15 months from now, something like that.
Is that irrespective of what your mother said to Matt Lauer?
Yeah, God bless her. What can I tell you? Look, all I can say is we all have mothers, right? And when moms get that age particularly, that little alternator that, you know, that regulator that exists.
Gets a little haywire.
Gets a little haywire. She didn't have one to begin with, and now she's like, she is totally liberated, and God bless her.
On that note, thank you very much, Governor.
Thank you. Thanks. Thank you.